So those who would take the simple, straightforward Torah approach would say that the reason why they're in jail is because of their sins. They're being punished not just because of the crimes against the government or society, but actually they're being punished for all of their sins, and this is a way of atonement. When a person suffers in this world, that brings atonement in the next world. And so the person should accept the jail as a punishment and try to free himself or herself from any bad things that they might have done. A second approach is that jail is there because of the person's inappropriate attitudes. When your attitudes are inappropriate, your thoughts are inappropriate, then your words and your deeds become inappropriate. And as such, the person didn't get it before, and so now the person has to realize that the reason for being incarcerated, not being able to do what he or she wants to do, is because that while the person had the freedom to do what he or she wanted to do, that the person had the wrong attitudes with their lives. And that it was necessary, or it is necessary, for the person to learn to break the cycle of his or her own attitudes. That the jail is supposed to go ahead and bring the person to a higher appreciation and understanding about life. Maybe the person will be able to survive and get out of jail. And if not, at least the person will have elevated themselves to a higher understanding. But the purpose of jail is to get the person to a higher perspective, to change the way the person has been thinking to this point. The third approach to jail, let's say the person never did any sins, certainly not significant enough to be worthy of this punishment. And let's say the person's attitudes were right, the person had the proper perspectives, and still finds themselves in jail, unjustified, undignified. For example, in the Gulag in Russia. So I want to tell you a story that I told you before. There were two Hasidim. One was Rav Mendel Futterfass, a legend in his time and afterwards. The other, also a legend, not as great a legend as Rav Mendel, but a legend nonetheless, Rav Moshe Vyshetsky, who was arrested in 1948, helping many Jewish people to maintain their Jewish identity. He had 6 small children, one of whom he sent away to Paris to study. The other 5 remained behind. He had just had twins, and he was incarcerated. And life was bitter. It was a cold and dark prison in Siberia. There was no central heating. There was no toilet in the room. You only were allowed to relieve yourself once a day after a 15-minute exercise walking around the central area in the jail. Food was sparse. The only thing he could eat was bread and water, and sometimes not even the bread. And so Moshe Vyshetsky suffered, frustrated that he would not see his children, not knowing how his wife would take care of them or how they would survive. He would stay up at night wondering why it all happened. Why should it happen to him, a pious and holy man? And suddenly, at 3 a.m., he heard the sound of somebody crying. It wasn't an ordinary cry. It was not the cry of a man for his lover or for his mother. It was the cry of someone in deep meditative prayer. He had heard that cry before, but years before in yeshiva. And he wondered where it was coming from. And somehow, the jailer, the guard, communicated to him that there was a man in the next cell who was a friend of his, none other than Mendel Futerfas. Well, they got the message to each other that at 2, the next night they would talk. So, how could they talk? They talked through the sewer lines, the dirty, stinky sewer lines in the cold and dark cell. And exactly at 2 o'clock, Mendel whispers, Moshe. And Moshe hears him and whispers back, Mendel! And Mendel says to Moshe, Moshe, are you happy? And Moshe says, are you crazy? In this place? Who knows if I'll ever see the light of the sun again? And Mendel says, you have to be happy. Like this, they only have your body. If you're not happy, then they have your soul, your neshama. Mendel wasn't satisfied with that statement. Mendel bribed the guard with his food so that Moshe should be in his cell for 30 days. They spent all night long together singing Hasidic melodies, reminding themselves of things that they had seen and heard, saying Hasidic stories, talking over concepts in Hasidus. And after 30 days they parted. Mendel then confided later that he knew that he, Mendel, could survive the bitterness of the prison, but he wasn't sure about Ramosha. As strong as he was, you needed to be psychologically super strong to be able to survive. Years later, Rav Moshe told over the story and said, you know, I got out of Russia with my family intact. I came to Israel. I saw the Rebbe, saw my children married. I have a position as the spiritual guide of a major institution. But the happiest days of my life were those 30 days in the cell, in the dark, cold cell without any food, with Mendel Futerfas. What is the message of this story? The message of the story is that God is everywhere, and that God wants to be recognized everywhere, and that the deeper the exile, the less holiness is perceived, and the more bitterness there is. In that place, God is still there, and that the human being is never alone. And in that way, the human being actually is closer to God than in any other place. And that's why those were the best and happiest days of his life. Because in those days, in that place, in the dark, in the stench, in the brutal conditions, he was with God. And the purpose of jail is to recognize that even there, God's right there with you.